Good evening, and welcome to the first session of the first West Cork History Festival. If I'd realised it was that easy, I wouldn't have been so worried about the rather torrential rain we had this morning. Thank you all for coming. Saki, as you're probably all aware, said of the island of Crete that its people produced more history than it was possible to consume locally. He hadn't been to Cork. And the production, if not the consumption, of things that masquerade as history is something that is evidently continuing. But we're deeply grateful to have the chance over the course of this weekend also to listen to people who are practitioners of the study of history, why it's important to us, why it's particularly important to this country over the next few years. And in the course of the next couple of days, we're going to explore some of those themes, both themes relating to the revolutionary period in this country, to Ireland's involvement in the First World War, but also to a whole set of other subjects and periods in Cork, in Ireland as a whole, and internationally, because we believe this is a place from which it is interesting to consider the histories of all sorts of people in all sorts of places and times. West Cork has perhaps often been on the edge, but it has very rarely been marginal. So it's a huge privilege and pleasure to have as our opening speaker Professor Roy Foster. He is, in the minds of many, the preeminent historian of Ireland of his generation. He has written about the fraught politics between this island and its larger neighbour in the 19th and 20th century. He's written recently, of course, about the revolutionary period, about the generation that gave birth to an independent Irish nation and the sort of nation they created. And he's written, of course, the authorised biography of W.B. Yates and is working now on a biography of Seamus Heaney. His range is extraordinary, so for him to have made it to West Cork is perhaps no surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to welcome Professor Roy Foster.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for the invitation. Can you all hear me in this rather wide space? It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be invited by Simon, who was too modest to tell you of his brilliant Oxford career, where I knew him first before he became a highly successful headhunter, and therefore is now a far more powerful figure in Oxford than I would ever have hoped to be, since everyone who is looking for a head of a college instantly approaches Simon, who appoints everybody in Oxford. I just thought you might like to know who you have in your midst. And it's a pleasure, as always, to be in West Cork, a place I'm deeply fond of, and to talk about antagonism, a theme which I think will recur in this weekend. My talk will be fairly general, but will, I hope, be relevant to the kind of aspects that other people in more detailed papers will be picking up during the weekend. Now, if you can't hear me, because I'm conscious of how wide this is, will you stick up your hands and tell me to shout, but it seems to be carrying. I want to start with my title, which is, as some of you may have copped, a quote from the great Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was a very good hater. And when he was asked by a friend if he visited Ireland, the friend asked, "Will you be as hard on the Irish as you famously were on the Scots?" You may remember Johnson's biographer Boswell was very shocked by Johnson's vituperations against everything Scottish. Anyway, to his interlocutor's surprise, Johnson forcefully denied that he had anything against the Irish. For one thing, he said, while the Irish could annoy you in a teasing way, like a fly, the Scots got at your blood and sucked it like a leech. And unlike the despised Scots, he retorted, the Irish, sir, are not in a conspiracy to cheat the world by false representations of the merits of their countrymen. No, sir. The Irish are a very fair people. They never speak well of one another. Now, Johnson's prejudices might lead us to expect him to expand on the subject to the detriment of the Irish, but in fact, that's not the case. He admired the Irish. He believed the study of Irish literature should be cultivated. He believed that Ireland's traditions of piety and learning showed them to have been, as he put it, both an ancient and an illustrious people, again, unlike the Scots. And he was very anxious to stress Irish learning in order to drive home his contempt of Macpherson's Ossian poems, then very fashionable in the 18th century, which he thought, not incorrectly, were outrageous forgeries. It was the bloody Scots at it again. Above all, Johnson believed that the record of history showed how badly the Irish had been treated by the English, and perhaps that this was why they abused each other so much. Now, if you take a psychoanalytical view of Irish history, you might be tempted to think that this is indeed the reason for the depth and violence of Irish antipathies, man handing on misery to man until it deepens like a coastal shelf, in Philip Larkin's great phrase. And fashions in history writing are indeed shifting towards the psychological, with memory standing in for history, and a preoccupation with analysing the processes of memory instead of making an attempt to establish ascertainable facts. And as the search to reimagine experience takes over, so does the exploration of feeling and sensibility. And this has been a characteristic of the decade of commemorations in which we're immersed. I'll come back to that later. In particular, this kind of psychological approach to our history has led, I think, to the study of reconciliation and an emphasis on the plurality of experience, which is a very valuable emphasis indeed. But anyone who reads Irish history, and I'm tempted to say anyone who knows Irish historians, has to be struck by the vehemence with which animosity is invoked, declared, and sometimes acted upon. It's not just that vituperation comes very easily to Irish tongues, it's the extent to which violent antipathies are declared and acted out. So for this opening lecture for the West Cork History Festival, I thought I'd look a bit at the non-reconciliatory aspects of our shared history, the history of antagonism. Partly because, having successfully commemorated the anniversaries of the Third Home Rule Bill, the start of World War I, and above all the Easter Rising of 1916, we're now headed into remembering more disruptive events in the revolutionary decade which occurred a century ago. We're about to remember the Anglo-Irish War, the Treaty, and the Civil War. And it may be less easy to recognise and appreciate a plurality of views and identifications where these events were concerned, and it's worth considering why. And of course we are this weekend, as Simon subtly indicated, gathered in a part of Ireland where in those years of revolution and civil war, antagonisms were powerfully felt and acted upon, with results that have been the subject of much historical commentary, a good deal of it controversial. One of the impressive things about the programme of this festival, I think, is the way it's brought together so many people who've written authoritatively about the experience of antagonistic conflict in Cork and elsewhere, and I much look forward to hearing them. I don't want to trench on their territory in this opening lecture, but I do want to consider the extent to which the aftermath of a colonised history necessarily involves centuries of simmering antagonism that inevitably have to break out, much as Sigmund Freud posited in his theory of the return of the repressed impulses coming back and back because they're festering in the unconscious and producing what he calls symptomatic outbursts of chaos and violence. And here we might invoke Dr. Johnson again, speaking of the 18th century penal laws against Catholics, then very much in force when he was writing or speaking this. He remarked, "The Irish are in a most unnatural state, for we see there the minority prevailing over the majority. There is no other instance of such severity as that which the Protestants of Ireland have exercised against the Catholics. Did we tell them we've conquered them, it would be above board. To punish them by confiscation and other penalties as rebels was a monstrous injustice." And this was exactly the approach later taken in the late 19th century by the great historian Lecky in his landmark history of the 18th century. And I think historical revisionism hasn't altered that much. Though we now know more about the variation and nuance which characterized the way the penal laws necessarily operated on the ground, in essence they expropriated people of citizenship as well as of property rights on the basis of religious profession, and left, this is my point, a heritage of implacable resentment. And the penal laws are important, I think, because there is an intimate and complicated relationship in Ireland between Irish religious history and the history of hatred. Historians have generally fallen shy of this rather unpalatable subject, with a couple of notable exceptions, one of whom, Marianne Elliott, we're going to hear from later this weekend. Otherwise, before Marianne's work, one of the most useful general treatments of religious antagonism in Irish history was in fact by a journalist, Marcus Tanner, an extremely good book. And when we look at parts of the country where violent hatreds were most obviously enacted, there does seem to be a relationship of contestation for land or for power, which reflected in turn an uneasy balance between people of different faiths. This isn't only applicable to Ulster, as people sometimes assume. And what seems undeniable is that, as complex as Irish Ancien Regime society was, it left behind a rationale by which future antipathies could be and were excused. Just as interesting, and probably as significant, is the way that historic social and political resentments and antipathies were negotiated after social and political discriminations against the Catholic majority were removed, and a Catholic bourgeoisie entered its kingdom in political and economic terms, if not entirely in terms of social advancement and access to governing elites. I think this is what we're seeing happening at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Nonetheless, in those ostensibly relaxed and prosperous days of what might be called Edwardian Ireland, there seems to have been a sense that old resentments were being moderated and a new class was in the ascendant. This was a widely held expectation in what contemporaries like Stephen Gwynn, who lived through the revolution, called the Ireland of yesterday. And since we're in Mr. Knox's country here, the great Flurry Knox, it's worth pointing out that for this Ireland, of course, some of the best and the subtlest guides are the novels of Somerville and Ross, whose authors were alive to the social shifts, snobberies and resentments around them in an extrasensory way, while also, since we're only human, epitomizing several of them themselves. Another subtle guide at a later date to the inheritance of violent antipathy is Joseph O'Neill's study of his own family history and their possible involvement in the murder of Admiral Boyle's Somerville, not far from here, in 1935. O'Neill is better known as a novelist, and indeed to trace the way, this is one of the points I want to make, that hatred operates in Irish history, it's often more illuminating to look at fiction and poetry. And certainly a recognition of Irish hatred fuels the work of W.B. Yates. Early on, this chimed both with his Fenian politics and his preoccupation with pre-Christian Ireland and the underlying footprint that this left on the Irish mind and Irish culture. The ancient Irish, he wrote, did not weigh and measure their hatred, but focused it into a pure idea. And from this idealism comes a certain power of saying and forgetting things, especially a power of saying and forgetting things in politics, which others do not say or forget. Throughout his life, Yeats agonized about the ambivalence of feeling which was inseparable from being an Irishman with a Protestant inheritance and a life lived partly in England, and a mental furniture which was steeped in English literary culture. And towards the end of his life, in 1937, he wrote, "The Irishry have preserved their ancient deposit through wars which during the 16th and 17th centuries become wars of extermination. No people," Lecky said, "have undergone greater persecution, nor did that persecution altogether cease up to our own day. No people hate as we do, in whom that past is always alive. There are moments when hatred poisons my life, and I accuse myself of effeminacy because I have not given it adequate expression. Then I remind myself that though mine is the first English marriage I know of in the direct line, all my family names are English. I owe my soul to Shakespeare, to Spenser, to Blake, perhaps to William Morris, to the English language in which I think, speak and write, that everything I love has come to me through English. My hatred tortures me with love, my love with hate. I am like the Tibetan monk who dreams at his initiation that he is eaten by a wild beast and learns on waking that he himself is eater and eaten. This is Irish hatred and solitude, the hatred of human life that made Swift write Gulliver and the epitaph upon his tomb, and that can still make us wag between extremes and doubt our sanity. Yates wrote this 20 years after the Irish Revolution began. But during that revolution, as his own politics shifted uncertainly back towards a more radical nationalism, he comes back and back to these themes of hatred, fanaticism and violence, famously in the great image of the stone in the stream in his poem Easter 1916. But above all, perhaps, and this is one of the things we're going to be facing up to over the next few years, it was the Civil War which directed his mind towards the way violence and hatred operated in Irish history. His great sequence of poems, Meditations in Time of Civil War, opens with an invocation of ancestral houses, creating an unforgivable image of the beauty and privilege of an Arcadian landscape created around a grand country house. Surely among a rich man's flowering lawns, amid the rustle of his planted hills, life overflows without ambitious pains and rains down life, until the basin spills and mounts more dizzy high, the more it rains, as though to choose whatever shape it wills, and never stoop to a mechanical or servile shape at others' beck and call. But by the end of the poem, Yeats is facing up to the fact that the privilege inseparable from the creation of a great house is based on the violence of conquest and dispossession. And he also makes the point more worryingly and less obviously that the energy and vision which made such a civilization is itself inseparable from the energy of hatred, violence and conquest, and that it may dissipate in more equable times. Some violent, bitter man, some powerful man, called architect and artist in, that they, bitter and violent men, might rear in stone the sweetness that all longed for night and day, the gentleness none there had ever known. But when the master's buried, mice can play, and maybe the great-grandson of that house, for all its bronze and marbles, but a mouse. Oh, what if gardens where the peacock strays with delicate feet upon old terraces, or else all Juno from an urn displays before the indifferent garden deities? Oh, what if levelled lawns and gravelled ways, where slippered contemplation finds his ease, and childhood a delight for every sense, but take our greatness with our violence? What if the glory of escutcheoned doors and buildings that a haughtier age designed, the pacing to and fro on polished floors amid great chambers and long galleries lined with famous portraits of our ancestors, what if those things, the greatest of mankind, consider most to magnify or to bless, but take our greatness with our bitterness? Now, when Yeats makes this uncomfortable conjunction between hatred, bitterness, and historical privilege, he's impelled to these thoughts by the Civil War, which is happening all around him as he writes this poem. He's writing it in his Elizabethan tower house near Gort, Tour Ballylee, a tower which he uses as the emblem of Irish historical antagonism in another great poem sequence. And as he ages, his preoccupation with hatred remains, but it's hatred between the Irish rather than hatred between the Irish and the British. A poem like Blood and the Moon about the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins is very much that. So why were the hatreds that emerged in the Civil War so powerfully intense? Perhaps because they mirrored and succeeded to the brotherhood, the exalted brotherhood of the War of Independence. Because unlike the nearly contemporary Spanish and Greek civil wars, which saw long simmering social and political and class antagonisms burst into flame, the Irish Civil War did actually pit brother against brother. And its origins were not in a pre-existing split between left and right. Michael Collins believed, according to a note kept by Richard Mulcahy, that the national struggle against British rule succeeded because it didn't involve social reform and social revolution, because it was based on an impulse deeper than what he called mere social revolution and the meaningless abstraction of social reform. Collins wrote, "It was consciousness of the vital, indestructible Gaelicism within us that infused the movement with a powerful sense of fraternal purpose and carried us to success where previous movements failed." But it's ironic that he wrote this because, of course, as subsequent events and his own death proved, that vehemence fractured into the most violent antagonism and hatred after 1921. How this came about, I think, is still obscure. The treaty debates in Dáil Éireann suggest a degree of pre-existent and underlying resentment between certain leaders, as do other sources. The young and the ambitious in any revolution are implicitly in contest with each other for the levers of power, though this is often obscured by the rhetoric of fraternity, and the easy identification of a common enemy. The fact that the common enemy back then was the Irish Parliamentary Party, fellow Irishmen and usually fellow Catholics, just as much as the British Army or the RIC, is often uncomfortably clear in the polemic of Patrick Pearse or Aid de Blackham. To make the new Jerusalem, Irish Home Rulers were to be rooted out as ruthlessly as British governors, and were seen and identified as legitimate objects of hatred. Pearse's invocation of the power and necessity of hatred in his essay The Sovereign People, written just before the Rising, is very striking, because in it he denies that hate is barren. He says hate is productive. He denies that a gospel of hate is barren, that a nation cannot feed itself on hate, or at least to the without peril to its soul or to the sanity and sweetness of its mind. It's not true, he says, that Davis, who preached love, is a truer leader or guide than Mitchell, who preached hate. Love and hate, Pearse writes, are not mutually antagonistic, they're mutually complementary. Love of good connotes hate of evil, love of truth, hate of falsehood, love of freedom, hate of oppression. Hate, he concludes, is not only a good thing, but a duty. This, in some ways, reflects a very European-wide moment, the jarring of all sorts of old expectations released by the First World War. But it also strikes a note of the end of what I've called Edwardian Ireland and its polite collusions. And having spent some time, as Simon said, working on the revolutionary era, the pre-revolutionary era, I've tried to trace the way that the rhetoric changes in the years leading up to 1916. And it does seem to me we can discern a kind of fast-forward effect from around 1907-8, with the revival of the IRB and Tom Clark's return to Ireland, the coalescing of a broad front radical political movement around Sinn Féin, and the growing prominence of feminism and socialism. And the confrontational, uncompromising and explicitly violent rhetoric advanced by Arthur Griffith, William Bulfin, Dennis Moran, Maud Gonne and other talented journalists and activists is arresting. With many of these people it goes with a vein of anti-Semitism, which reminds us of similar themes in Austria and Hungary in these years. Less obviously, this also seems to me the point where a distinct sense of generational change is present and articulated. Again, I've written about this at length in a recent book, and I won't repeat myself here. But it's very noticeable how strong the appeal the new generation makes to hatred of compromise, to crushing out the evil thing is. And the necessity of hatred recurs in Terence McSweeney's diaries, in Maud Gonne's account of her ceremony of reception into the Catholic Church in 1903, and in other places you mightn't expect it. Called on to renounce all heresies, she wrote, I said I hated nothing in the world but the British Empire, which I looked on as the outward symbol of Satan in the world, and in this form I made my solemn abjuration of Anglicanism and the declaration of hatred of England. One might also instance a few years later the revolutionary Mabel Fitzgerald's mark to her ex-employer George Bernard Shaw in 1914, assuring him that she was bringing up her young son in the sound traditional hatred of England and all her ways. You should just hear him say, Sassenach. The concentrated hate in his voice is worthy of Drury Lane. She actually misconstrued her audience, because Shaw replied, Mabel, as an Ulster woman, you must be aware that if you bring up your son to hate anybody except a papist, you will go to hell. You must be a wicked devil to load a child's innocent soul with a burden of old hatreds and rancours that Ireland is sick of. You make that boy a good international socialist, a good Catholic, in fact, in the true sense, and make him understand that the English are far more oppressed than any folk he ever sees in Ireland by the same forces that have oppressed Ireland in the past. In the terms of the future, though, Mabel, I think, was nearer the mark than GBS. What neither of them anticipated back then in 1914 was the extent to which the emotion of hatred would flare up between Irish people, rather than being directed simply towards the ancient oppressor. This would lead to a deep disillusionment, in fact, for Mabel and many others like her in the 1920s, the subject of some very interesting recent work by Francis Flanagan and others. This loss of optimism becomes more comprehensible if we look more carefully at the progress of the Irish Revolution itself. And writing about it, I'm very struck by the shift in, so to speak, personnel around 1918 to 19, when Sinn Féin sweep the board in the general election, when all sorts of new faces appear, not only in Dáil Éireann but in county councils, and when a policy of waging guerrilla war on police and army takes over. And it seems to me that in many cases, the people who seize the initiative then are different from the opinion formers who've made the running during the pre-revolution. The radical theorists, the cultural revolutionaries, the feminists, the socialists, give way to a more uncompromising and in many ways more traditionalist element of freedom fighter. Certainly an older rhetoric of faith and fatherland takes over, and it's amplified by the Catholicization of the revolution. The Catholic Bulletin adopts the signatories of the 1916 proclamation as saints. It places them in the tradition of early Irish Christianity, where lives of self-denial, fortitude and sacrifice are celebrated, along with themes of renunciation and the redemption of mankind on the pure Peircean model. Peirce's mother indeed forecast the day would come when her son's bones would be lifted as they were the bones of saints. Now, this had not been the objective of all the revolutionaries, who were in several cases a good deal more hard-headed and secular-minded and even sensual than the company of saints. Some of them, like Bulmer Hobson, would later remember sadly what fun they had had in their revolutionary youth. But fun, not to mention secularism, was at a discount in the transfigured state of existence after the executions of 1916. Still, the revolution did take place against an upheaval in hearts and minds which characterises Europe before 1914. It's one of those generational shifts of tempo. We see it in France in the 1780s or America in the 1960s, whereby a generation sees itself in contradistinction to the acceptance world of their parents, attempts to project change into the world at large from the changes happening within them. And those are the kind of issues that seem to me phased out when the fighting starts. People like Arthur Griffith run the risk of being sidelined, and indeed one of the unexplained and, I think, unexamined elements in the revolution is the way Griffith negotiates his way back into a position of influence and brings off a treaty settlement which harks back to the ideas of early Sinn Féin. Was he after a dual monarchy all along? It's striking how those who emerge as leaders of the struggle are often figures unfamiliar to the pre-revolutionary radical elite, many of whom ask themselves, who is this Eamon de Valera? And it's striking how many people like Bulmer Hobson, like Patrick McCartan, who were instrumental in reviving the IRB, then become disillusioned in the 1920s. The same is true of P.S. O'Hegarty, Hannah Sheehy-Skeffington, and several others. And these feelings of disillusionment, antipathy, bitterness often are not perhaps recorded or perhaps underrepresented in the rich archives of the Bureau of Military History witness statements. Which leads us back to what memory suppresses and remembers and can galvanise, and how important that is to the decade of commemorations. Recurring to a point I made earlier, one of the striking ways in which the history of Ireland has been opened out and reconceived is by seeing it as closer to the histories of Central and Eastern Europe than we often realise. It's worth remembering, especially at this awful moment of British history, John Stuart Mill's remark that Ireland is in the mainstream of European historical experience, while England is in an eccentric tributary of its own. Historians of Europe such as Robert Gervart, John Horne and Tim Wilson have illuminated the way in which, for Central and Eastern Europe, the First World War didn't end in 1918, That year ushered in a period of destabilisation, paramilitary banding, enforced shifts of borders and peoples, and intercommunal conflict. If you look at Ireland in those years, 1918 to 1923, it's exactly mirroring the history of Central and Eastern Europe. And indeed, Sinn Féin wanted Ireland to be seen as a European country, as their attempt to send envoys to Versailles showed, and their creation from a very early stage of consular representatives in foreign countries, subject of a pioneering book recently by Gerard Keown. Now, the difference, of course, as you'll have instantly thought, between Central and Eastern Europe and Ireland in these years is the extent of violence and the depth of intercommunal warfare. For all the horrors of something like the killings at Ballyseedy or the drifting away of Protestant populations in parts of rural Ireland, the scale of violence, even in northeastern Ireland, is of a different order to what happened in Poland, Hungary or the Ukraine. The seismic aftershock of the dislocation of the Austro-Hungarian, Russian and Ottoman empires provides reason enough. Though Britain's empire was also on the wane, that wasn't yet seen, and it would be a much less dramatic process. But there are also, as Tim Wilson has shown, infrastructural and historic reasons why frontiers of violence, designating separate religions and cultural communities, could sustain a kind of coexistence in Ulster which they couldn't in, let's say, Silesia. And we might also look back to something I mentioned earlier, the relative weights and balances of different religious traditions in different places, and the way in which the state that emerged from the Irish Revolution handled the matter of inherited violence. This was charted some time ago by Arthur Mitchell and Tom Garvin, and also in Brian Hughes's recent book about the relationship between the IRA and the civilian community during the Revolution. These stratagems laid important groundwork for the way the new state evolved and the way that police and army authorities were reconstituted against a background that made that reconstitution seem a very tricky matter indeed. A lively debate has sprung up about the meaning of democracy as established in the Free State and the competing notions of politics epitomised at the time. And there's also been a very important historiographical concentration on what violence, coercion and intimidation mean at local levels. A lot of very interesting local studies at PhD level have investigated this. The restabilisation of Ireland in the 1920s was paralleled in some other European countries which had experienced violent paramilitary activity. Social conservatism, a turn towards censorship, a deep-rooted fear of communism were happening in Ireland, but also in so many other European countries. Very striking parallels there. But one very important factor influencing the way things developed here concerns the fact that there had already been a revolution in landholding, precipitated by the Land War of 1879 to 81 and sustained by the government policy of enabling tenants to purchase their holdings. And as one Cork revolutionary, John Marcus O'Sullivan, noted, this had the effect of curtailing the impulses towards social radicalism, those impulses that Michael Collins didn't like, among those directing the political revolution against rule. O'Sullivan wrote, with obvious relief, "It is well for us that the two revolutions through which we have passed in the last half-century were separate in time, that in fact the agrarian revolution was largely at an end before the struggle for national independence became fully acute. Had the two coincided, the outlook would indeed be menacing." I think it can be assumed that there would have been massive expropriations and a great deal more violence. There's also the fact that the conservative nature of Irish society was underwritten by the power of the Catholic Church, in social as well as political terms, and the nature of partition reinforced this, because it made the Free State, later the Republic, an almost entirely Catholic unit, with a very small minority of Protestants, who rapidly accepted the status of the new political entity and initially at least played a part in its commercial, economic and professional life disproportionate to their numbers. The Irish Free State provided, it must be said, a much warmer house, to borrow David Trimble's phrase, for its tiny Protestant minority than Northern Ireland did for its large Catholic minority. Although there was, as we will be encountering again at this festival, a probably disproportionate exodus of Protestants from the south in the immediate aftermath of independence. How different a 32-county Ireland with a large, perhaps 25% minority Protestant population would have been is an intriguing counterfactual. The historian Tom Garvin has suggested that if partition hadn't happened and the new state had had to accommodate Northern Unionists, things would have turned out as they did in the Balkans in the 1990s. Others, including myself, might be less pessimistic. But certainly what made 26-county Ireland's path sui generis was partly the power of the Catholic Church and the almost monolithic religious composition of the populace, as well as the rapid development of a widely accepted unarmed police force and a small and carefully regulated army. It's less often pointed out that there was also the implicit continuity of themes and forms of government inherited from the years of British rule. Despite ambitions for a different dispensation, a two-party democratic, bicameral parliamentary system evolved with a powerful and independent civil service. And despite a radically redrawn constitution in 1937, many legal forms and practices bore strong family resemblances to Britain. And here's another area where Sinn Féin's ideas, which were much more radical in terms of social and political organisation, fade into the background. Even their economic protectionism wasn't really taken up until the 1930s, faute de mieux. Speaking last year at the Irish Centre in Camden Town, London, near where I live, I was asked why, despite the extent of violence in the Anglo-Irish and Civil Wars, such a stable state emerged, unlike other European countries in the 20s and 30s. My answer was that this happened for the same reason that the revolution succeeded in the first place, i.e. that the revolutionaries had the good fortune to be rebelling against a liberal democratic state, unlike the dissolving empires elsewhere in Europe, because the British government had therefore to demonstrate an enforced responsiveness to domestic public opinion, which reacted against the Black and Tan policies and pushed Lloyd George to terms. It's also true that the stability which my questioner was mentioning arose, as I've just mentioned, from the fact that the new state mimicked so many legal, political and cultural forms of the British government ethos. It wasn't the utopia of the revolutionaries, especially the first wave revolutionaries, but it was effective nonetheless. And despite the history of hatred, they moved rapidly to accommodating and even friendly relations with the ex-oppressor. This is what enabled the cynical Arthur Balfour, in the past a Chief Secretary of Ireland as well as a Tory Prime Minister, to observe in 1928, "The Ireland of today is the Ireland we made." Not a very welcome thought for some of us. But it also seems to me that the emphasis on historical victimhood and oppression, so marked in the rhetoric of the revolution, obscures the fact that in Edwardian Ireland the obvious forms of oppression by Ireland were in the past. I've mentioned land reform. Certainly condescension and various forms of exclusion continued, read your Somerville and Ross. But the processes of land ownership, taxation reform, local government reform, old age pensions, and the social conservatism of the Catholic Church and the clientelist hegemony of the Irish Parliamentary Party were creating in Ireland a materialist Anglophone world against which the idealism of the revolutionary generation rebelled. This analysis wasn't universally well received when I offered it to the Camden Irish Centre, and one member of the audience truculently remarked that all Ireland's post-revolutionary problems arose from the fact that we never had a truly Gaelic form of government. I didn't ask whether this meant reversion to the Brehon laws or the institution of high kings or just dynastic succession. But the concept raises what some historians have seen as a sort of conflict between a Gaelic romantic versus an Irish Enlightenment trope of politics, which was being argued out in very sophisticated terms often after the revolution. And that suggests another fault line along which antagonism developed. And negotiating it required care and subtlety. The conservatism of the post-revolutionary statement had its advantages. The power of the church in matters of state, the implicit continuities in the era of British rule, these made for social stability in a time of European upheaval, as well as moderating local antagonisms between communities. But neither factor could be openly acknowledged, and conservative Irish administrations operated within strict and coded parameters. That's how you negotiate a history of antagonism. Plus the prevalence of large-scale emigration, especially of the young, which helps sustain the stasis, and the low-key state of industrial unionisation, and you might say of industry altogether. And these issues need to be remembered when we try and understand why and how a state founded on violence and a political party system founded on the old hatreds of the Civil War managed as well as it did. This also lies behind the negotiation of official memory. As Mary Daly and others have incisively shown, the question of commemoration came sharply into focus from the early years of the new state in the 1920s. It was massaged by civil servants, claimed by politicians, furiously reacted to by old revolutionaries or their relicts who felt sidelined. And the history of a contested society can be traced through the way that commemorations were enacted in public. There was also the unstated conflict of the Civil War, raising that central question of what the revolution had been fought for, who had inherited it, and whether it was worth it. And those in power used commemorative activities to stress militarism, conveying the message of an independent military power, despite the fact that the army had become, in the words of one historian, a tiny internal security force combined with a squad of mounted ceremonial hussars and a good jumping team. But there were several less obvious demonstrations at work too. The half-centenary of 1916, celebrated in 1966, was a matter not only of triumphalism but of diplomatic evasion and frantic brinkmanship behind the scenes of who was in and who was out. The survival of some of the principles of the stirring events of 50 years before, notably Eamon de Valera, added to the mystique and raised awkward questions, notably when de Valera and others used the commemorations to invoke a wish to complete the revolution by ending partition. By the time of the 75th anniversary in 1991, given what was actually happening north of the border, a low-key approach was taken, covering up disagreements between the scenes, particularly between Taoiseach Haughey, ex-gunrunner to the Provost, and President Mary Robinson, who'd made a particular cause of listening to the Unionist case. How much these, or the rhetorical revanchism which was happening in 1966 helped galvanise ancient hatreds in the north, which has been claimed is an actual argument, is something I'm uncertain about. I'm more inclined to believe recent historiography that sees the early 60s as the time in the north when old hatreds were actually being negotiated and the two communities were moving towards cautious accommodation. The eruptions from 1969 changed everything, and what they meant for the history of antagonism in the island of Ireland is too big a subject for this lecture tonight. But the reasons why a more iconoclastic approach to Irish history advanced into prominence from this very time clearly had much to do with the use of history and of hatred being made by combatants in the north, as well as wider historiographical influences too. Faith and fatherland views had carried a strong charge of manifest destiny. The more existentialist mentality of the 1960s preferred to investigate alternative futures and to see the past as a series of open questions. A generation later, it was against this background that Peter Hart began the investigations which suggested that a certain amount of nationalist violence, especially during the truce, represented vengeance against perceived enemies within the community at large rather than British forces. The controversy that this unleashed raised the emotional temperature and provides one reason why I took this subject of antagonism for this evening's opening lecture. But one result of the historiographical energies released by the controversy of after Hart's work has been, I think, a much more nuanced and a less extreme analysis of Protestant depopulation, and I think a moderation of high-flown assertions, which may also mean a moderation of Cork exceptionalism, I'm sorry or glad to say. And we'll hear some of this from historians like Andy Bielenberg and David Fitzpatrick later in the conference. And there is a sense in which Irish historians have advanced in gingerly fashion towards a common ground where nuance is explored and sheep and goats are allowed mingle together. I think, to my own surprise, The recent commemorations allowed and enabled this, and those of us who were sceptical at the outset must now admit it. It seems clear that memory, that awkward concept I began with, replacing history, has been allowed to complicate the national narrative and to bring the realization that there were other identifications, other narratives subscribed to in Ireland 100 years ago, notably, as Simon mentioned, in terms of the vast numbers of Irish people who fought and died in the First World War, but also in terms of communities who just wanted to keep their heads down while the fires of history raged above them, Protestants as well as Catholics. We've also learned something from other commemorative jamborees in Ireland, such as the 150th anniversary of the Great Famine in 1995 and the bicentenary of the 1798 Rising in 1998. The memory of the famine allowed for a certain amount of well-meant but sometimes questionable psychotherapeutic statements about trauma, survivor guilt and collective memory. A few years later, the bicentenary of 1798 told a rather different story. There were many illuminating exhibitions, there were some terrific books, but the Irish government of the day took a leading and politicised role, galvanised by the peace process unfolding then in the late 90s in the north. The fact that Northern Presbyterians had been in the vanguard of revolutionary Republican activity 200 years ago was just too good to miss, and a determined effort was made to equate this to the efforts of Irish politicians in the present day, twinning late 18th century sectarian violence with late 20th century Eurospeak and using French revolutionary connections to meld the two, which meant dismissing, I think, the realities of the day as retrospective rationalizations imposed by historians and airbrushing out cross-community violence and hatred. Now, this seems to me exactly what the commemorative activities for the last few years have tried to avoid and succeeded in avoiding. And I think one of the reasons is because historians have, as I've mentioned earlier, been examining the effects of violence on local communities, very relevant to this conference. But it should be remembered that revolutionary consciousness is necessarily about extremism, enmity, repudiation, and what Yates roundly called fanaticism and hatred, not to mention terror and death. The rationalization of pre-revolutionary conditions plays a large part in official memory, and it means smoothing out a lot of this in favour of the pietistic and the feel-good side, while the tourist industry brands heritage-scapes and the macabre phenomenon of thanatourism, which means tourism that concentrates on scenes of death and slaughter, necessarily bringing the history of hatred back to the fore again. The government was determined to avoid this over the last few years and was originally criticised in some quarters for their caution by those who would have preferred straightforward celebration and unproblematic lines of dissent. But I think they took the right path. Finally, commemorating 1916 and what happened afterwards is different from remembering the famine or 98, which were disasters in their different ways. The 1916 Rising is the foundational point in the history of the state, though I will be contradicted by some, maybe even some in this audience. And those who planned it are necessarily seen as founders of that state. But there are complicating factors. For one thing, we can't tell how far the state which emerged would have been endorsed by those signatories since they were executed. Yates wrote, "We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead." But if we try actually to get close to what they dreamed, it's extremely hard. Much of it seems pretty far removed from the ethos of the Irish Free State. And moving to the present, we can't ignore peace walls in the north, or ghost estates in the south, or the contested history of religious demography all over the island, because they stem from our history too. In conclusion, I'd like to also say that we should be wary about reading history in the way we wish it had happened. For instance, the history of the Russian Revolution has now been written in a very different way. Not only because new archives are being opened, but because new perspectives are allowed their space. We now confront a completely different idea of Russia's record in the First World War, of its internal economy, of Germany's role in the Bolshevik takeover, of class relations within Russian society, and of the sheer contingency of events which produced the Bolshevik victory. None of this squares with the official determinist view that we were fed, especially from Russia, up to the 1990s. But it seems more convincing, and it leads to a kind of, I think, liberation. The Irish Revolution wasn't like the Russian one, to the relief of John Marcus O'Sullivan. but it should similarly be seen as the result of antagonisms working below the surface, as well as an extraordinary combination of circumstances and of actors. Bitterness, badgering, lovelessness reflect verbal violence in a contested society, it's been well said. This is also reflected in the verbal violence, which is perhaps the comparatively benign inheritance from an Irish history where violence was often much more than verbal. Bringing to attention what divided Irish people in the past as well as what united them, and facing up to uncomfortable truths, is what we're here to do. I'll close with a final quotation from Yates, this time from a private letter, written when he was considering moving to Ireland in 1921, just before the treaty had been narrowly ratified and the threat of civil war loomed. He wrote in December 1921, "I am in deep gloom about Ireland, for though I expect ratification of the treaty from a plebiscite, I see no escape from bitterness and extreme men may carry the country. When men are very bitter, death and ruin draw them on as a rabbit is supposed to be drawn on by the dancing of the fox. In the past week I've been planning to live in Dublin, but I feel now all may be blood and misery. If that comes, we may abandon Ballylee to the owls and the rats, and England too, where passion will rule, and I will find myself with no answer, and live in some far land. Should England and Ireland be divided beyond all hope of remedy, what else could we do for the children's sake, or for one's own work? I could not bring them to Ireland, where they would inherit bitterness, nor leave them in an England where, being Irish by tradition, they would be in an unnatural condition of mind, and grow, as so many Irishmen who live here do, sour and argumentative." There's a touch of Dr. Johnson's generalisations there. But it brings us back to the Civil War. And the encouraging thing is that Yates did come back to live in Ireland and lived through the Civil War, even though it broke out. It inspired that great poetry of the Tower, including those meditations which I read from earlier, where he confronted traditional hatreds, but called for the honey bee to come build in the empty house of the star, and to make something positive out of a history of antagonism and hatred. At the same time, he never stopped interrogating what he called in a later poem civil rancour and its roots in Irish history and culture. We shouldn't shrink from it either, as I expect the first West Cork History Festival will amply demonstrate, even if it also partly bears out Dr. Johnson's judgment about speaking ill of each other, always, of course, in the interests of fairness. Thank you.
Roy, thank you. A characteristically comprehensive tour d'horizon of the complexity of commemoration and memory, and also the possibility of plurality in the process. I do think, though, that underestimating the importance to national well-being of a good jumping team is a dangerous thing to do.
I didn't underestimate.
Roy has said he has time for a few questions. I think we have a roving mic. Do we have any questions? John. There's a...
Yeah, Professor Foster.
John.
Oh, my apologies.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think a thank you from all of us for a brilliant and illuminating lecture. I was reminded with your comment in relation to Russia of a wonderful comment by a Russian historian who said, "It is the future that is certain in Russia, only the past is a matter of constant change," which I thought illuminated that particular change. My question to you is this line of antagonism, which you have sketched so eloquently and persuasively, something that is a matter of history and is dying out, suppressed by the two enormous forces of affluence and the obliteration of good investigative journalism and the abandonment of proper news to the proliferation of popular opinion in many news channels. Do you think this homogeneity of superficial commentary on our condition, together with affluence, is beginning to obliterate the antagonisms?
That's a very complex and interesting question. And by the way, thanks for that wonderful Russian quote. Louis Namir said that we imagine the future and remember the past, which is a different way of saying the same thing. Very clever. I worry very much about the level of public discourse, not so much in this country, which has a very active and independent press and a great tradition of investigative journalism. What's happening in America, where the country is ruled by a vindictive cretin who works by tweet, suggests to me something extremely ominous about the state and the nature even of public politics in America. And the divisions within American society, which I think are coming to the fore, which came to the fore in the election campaign, and I suppose have been coming to the fore with the last generation, are to me profoundly disturbing. If we're staying in Ireland, I think let's deal with our Irish exceptionalism for this weekend. I think the historic antagonisms moderate over time, except when they're kept alive by perceived injustices, as happened, I think, in the northeast of this country. The language of antagonism that derives from injustice and violence and hatred in history, as in our part of the world, will moderate, but it sometimes diffuses into language rather than actions. And it does seem to me that the rhetoric of the way that people assail each other in public in Ireland is more extreme than in other countries, the other countries I know, and that this has real historic as well as psychological roots. It makes life fun in many ways, but it also reflects, I think, a more sinister reality. It also may well, along with the great oral tradition and everything else, have a great deal to do with the extraordinary ascendancy of Irish literature on the world stage. But that's another issue which has only just occurred to me. I think, to get back to the centre of your question, historic antagonisms are being muted, but I don't think that the lowering of standards of the way that public discourse is conducted, which is so obvious in America and will spread as everything does from America, I don't think that is an encouraging augury for eliminating them altogether, because what's happening in America is that denigration of public discourse is encouraging and reviving and indulging, I think, a language of hatred.
Yes, Professor Foster, I think you made a very worthwhile contribution. But why do you...
But
Professor Foster, you made a very worthwhile contribution, but why do you let yourself down with expressions like Charles Haughey, ex-Provy gun runner? Charles Haughey was tried before a court of peer of his people in a sovereign democratic state, and he was found not to be that. And I'm sure a much greater person than I, Martin Manstra, who we hope might be here this weekend, would be the first person on his feet this evening to challenge you on that point.
He has been before and will be again. You could say that Charles Haughey's brother was the actual gun runner, I suppose. But I think everything that's emerged since that peculiar trial has shown that his hands were up to the elbows in those boxes of guns. But I take your point, and maybe it was maybe I shouldn't be frivolous at the West Cork History Festival. I won't be again.
I was curious about your examination of the reasons why stability settled so rapidly in Ireland after the Civil War by comparison to states in Eastern Europe. And I just wondered whether there was another factor which may have been relevant, which was that the collapsing empires and the war-ravaged countries of Central Europe were not in a position to provide continuity of the taxation system and of the structures of national debt, which provided the stability and perhaps protection from inflation and those sorts of factors. And I wonder whether that would also have been a significant factor.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And just by instancing those factors, you do show just how different conditions were. I think I was more trying to make a psychological and cultural parallel, though I did say that the scale of what was happening in the disruptions in Central and Eastern Europe, even the scale of the changing of borders and of the destruction of whole forms of government, was very different from what looks more and more... What strikes me more and more looking at the history of the early Free State is the extraordinary ability of many of the people who architected it and their readiness for continuity and the often unsung role of civil servants in bringing this about. And that, of course, was exactly what the countries of Central and Eastern Europe didn't have. One can make the parallels too readily given the infrastructural solidity of Ireland after the Civil War, though there were enormous threats as well, which we shouldn't forget. But the points you make about the economy are very well taken. Thank you.
Perhaps the final question for Deputy Martin.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for what was a very stimulating debate. And may I say, just to the credit of Charles Jahahi, Ed Maloney has written a very good piece in terms of the origins of the peace process and a relatively unknown role that the one C. Jahahi played in terms of the early stages of the peace process with others, which was well documented by Ed Maloney. But the real reason I'm ringing, I think the idea of conflict and the Civil War, it seems to me the role of personality is key, or the role of personalities. And it seems to me also the bridge between elites, if you like, and the mass population. And I get the sense that the elites and the mass population collectively had no stomach for the Civil War, ultimately. It's relatively short, in terms of duration. And you get early on a sense of even a divide within the anti-treaty outside of the civil wing wanting to move on, if you like, and getting out of it. And that's almost reflected later on in terms of even the formation of the party that I happen to be leader of, in the sense that abstentionism was draining any enthusiasm for what was going on. So in other words, I think we were fortunate in the sense, relatively speaking, in terms of, I think you're right in terms of the continuity. The parliamentary tradition, which Brian Farrell wrote about, was a factor in stability. The land war having been over, and all of that. But also a sense, I think, that some people would write that the Civil War was almost accidental in terms of initiation and how it happened, and that over time people really had no stomach for it. And I think when certain personalities took control, when Aiken took control and so on, that you were heading towards a cessation. And the role of personality in history sometimes gets understated, would be the point. I think that's the...
Thank you very much, Deputy. And as a history student as well as a politician, you speak with authority on this. I think you're right. I think the episodic nature of the Civil War and the geographical nature of the Civil War, which, as has been pointed out often, doesn't reflect the storm centres of the War of Independence. It's most active. It's not always active in the same places, and very often in very different places. But I think one of the things that fuels it is the abstract idea of the Republic, which, whatever the treaty provided, seemed very clearly not to be a republic. Although the Constitution rather brilliantly smuggled Republican forms into what was technically a non-Republican Constitution. That was one of the many subtleties with which I think things were smoothed over. But for an appreciable number, though a minority, but a very powerful minority, the notion of the Republic, indivisible, separate, had taken hold as a kind of revolutionary mantra. And it was, I'm always interested in the way that it was as galvanically powerful as any idea of Marxian or communist ideology would have been in other parts of Europe. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the interesting work recently done on the early 1920s about the Civil War and about tends to concentrate or to take in this idea of warring ideologies within Irish nationalism. And so maybe we're seeing something that was a subdued conflict before, but sputtered out afterwards. But you're absolutely right, I think, that it was for people who would live and die for the Republic, that was quite a small minority of the politically active, and a very small minority of the nation at large. Those who wanted to get on with it were not just the elites, I think, they were also the menu peuple. Thank you very much for your comments.
Before I ask you all to thank Roy Foster again for his contribution, before I ask you to thank him again, let me make a small plug for the next item in the West Cork History Festival programme, which is a screening this evening of Rebel Rossa, a figure, of course, who had a fairly clear view of the Republic that he wanted to see, although the memory and commemoration of it remains contested. That film will be screened in the Secret Garden, which is the other venue which you reach by going around the front of the house, following the signs, and it will be shown at 9:30. I commend it to you, made here last year and involving a number of local historians, including one who died tragically too young from UCC. So I commend it to you as the next item, and thank you all again for coming to the festival, and I hope you will all enjoy as much of the rest of the weekend as possible. But before we leave this place, let me ask you once again to thank Roy Foster for his opening contribution.